Welcome back, listener. This is part of our memoir series that we've been doing for multiple weeks here on the Inspired Writer Collective podcast. And today I am here with another guest. This is Paula Delgado-Kling, and she holds a degree in comparative literature, French civilizations, international affairs, and creative writing from Brown, Colombia, and the New School. Now, she recently published her book, Leonor, The Story of a Lost Childhood, in January of this year. And she received 2 grants in order to publish that first book. Excerpts have appeared in a number of places, including the Literary Review, Pacifica Literary Review. And now Paula is here to tell us a little bit about this book, which has both a nonfiction component and a memoir component. So this will be an interesting discussion of how all of that came to be. So Paula, I know when you and I spoke recently, you said that the inspiration for this entire full-length book actually started as a policy paper. So walk us through how did you get from, this policy paper and this concept of this lost childhood in, I believe it's Colombia, right?
Colombia.
And then to full-length nonfiction / memoir book.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Very nice, kind of you guys. So I started out this book as a policy paper when I was a grad student at Columbia University, when I was a grad student for international affairs. It was way back in 2001. And I was taking this course by somebody who worked, led by somebody who worked at the United Nations. And so I was interested in what the UN and what governments were doing in order to help children exercise their rights as children. Because according to the UN Convention, children have the right to grow up in freedom, have the right to food, to shelter, to education, to water, like all of these conventions that the UN and governments are supposed to uphold. So I turned to Colombia and I wanted to find out more about the children, the recruits from the armed groups, which are really drug gangs in Colombia. But at the time, I couldn't find any information on it. I reached out to local NGOs. I reached out to international NGOs. At the time, it turned out that Human Rights Watch was in the midst of editing and about to publish a report. But I really couldn't write my paper. That was due like tomorrow. So I decided that I wanted to maybe write a few articles here and there and ventilate the topic a little bit more and get it out there. And I went back to Bogotá and I got really stepped into the topic. I went into these group homes. In one particular group home, a group home like a halfway home, where these kids would come to receive help from the government after they've either handed themselves in or after they've been captured by the military. So it was a halfway home in Bogotá, and that's where I first really began to explore the topic. Which I had intended it to be more like magazine articles, maybe, I believe at the time I talked to 17, Mary Claire, like I had contacts at the Atlantic Monthly, that kind of thing. I wasn't sure what I was going to make of it. And then the more I learned about the topic and the more that I spoke to these children, and in particular to Leonor, I got more interested, and I couldn't wait to return back home every couple of months from New York to Bogotá to hear the latest in her recovery.
Very cool. That's so fascinating, the way like a story just kind of takes hold of you, right? And then like doesn't let go. I mean, you're talking, 2001, right? And now published in 2024, which is another theme I've seen with a lot of the people we've been interviewing recently about how long it can take sometimes to really process and digest a story and then get it out in a way that, that can be shared with a broader audience.
Yes, in this case, also, it's a nonfiction story. So it at first had to be reported. But as I learned from Leonor and the more I got to know her, she didn't know her own truth. So how would I be able to translate that onto the page? I couldn't. I had to wait through the years and be patient and go through episodes again and again with her to see what clarity she could bring to the story through all the psychological therapy and the reunification with her mother that she had. At first, when I first met her, she had only been out of the FARC, which is the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. It was at the time the biggest terrorist drug gang. They're drug gangs, really. At the moment, at that time in Colombia, and she'd only been out for 2 weeks. She had to decompress. Yes, she had to decompress. She had to find out what has happened, when and where and why and how, and to put her puzzle back together before I could even report it to see what had happened. So that's why this book took me all these years. I kept in touch with Leonor, really in touch, for about 19 years. And each time we would go through her story and again, and there were certain snippets of it that she had first mentioned that I learned through the years that maybe was less so of incidents that had really happened and more of her trying to convince herself with her thoughts that life wasn't as bad as she had lived and survived.
I mean, trauma is such a tricky thing to navigate anyways. What was it about Leonor's story that really drew you to tell her story as representative of the children who had fallen into this group versus someone else's? What stood out for you about her story?
It was the woman part. It was really, I learned the term through this book, really, like truly learned the term feminicide, which is when there's an attack on a woman simply because she's a woman. So her story really struck to me how vulnerable women are just because of the bodies that we have and what they represent. So in her being a little girl, like she was victimized because she was a little girl, because she has the body of a little girl, because she walks like a little girl, because little girls are pure, they're virginal. So that struck to me in the, we can talk feminism all the way and everything, but as she sometimes might have said to me, yes, you can like go back to your libraries and whatnot, but this is like the actual reality of what happens.
Mm-hmm. And what was it that finally, what ultimately led you to adding your own story, the memoir aspect into this nonfiction?
So I'm originally from Colombia. I was born in Bogotá, and my family very much has ties to Colombia still. And I wanted to explore my heritage there, my background in Colombia. And I guess in some way, I was also a little bit homesick because of the violence there and the insecurity. I never really got to grow up there. From a very young age, also when I was 9 years old, my family was forced to leave because there were a lot of threats against our family, just because my grandfather had had some success in construction. He was the mayor of Bogota for 4 times. And from his success, it came that we were a target of kidnappings. So I had to leave at 9 years old. So in some way, this was a coming of age book for me, even though it took all these years in order to understand, well, what were the circumstances that also forced me to not be able to grow up in Colombia, in my country where I was born. So in some way, there were similarities between Leonor and I because she's finding out what had happened to her. And I'm also finding out, looking back at politically, what was the situation, economically, what was the situation of the country at that time, how has the country evolved into what it did for Leonor, for me. So it's a coming of age for the both of us. It was really difficult as a story to put together in terms of the scaffolding of it. Like, when does her story go in? When does my voice go in to explain it as a narrator in terms of being also like a sort of cultural translator for a foreign reader? So I remember talking to my agent, who's wonderful, and she said, "Oh, Paula, these kinds of books just take that long. Like, it just is. It takes that long. Don't worry about it." So every day I just kind of chipped at it a little and a little and a little, got like math headaches and just kept going and going and going. And I would lay out these drafts. Sorry. In my apartment.
It's okay.
And I would lay out the drafts in my apartment, like all the way across the floor. And then, because we live in New York and it wasn't a huge apartment, I would lay out a towel on top of it, like nobody moved, nobody touched. Then my daughter would come in. She was young. And I was like, okay, get her away from the towel. Like, that's where my draft is, on the floor. You can't touch it. And it was just,
Yeah.
like, literally with pieces of paper and scissors and just cutting, like, oh, maybe that belongs there, that belongs here, and just all laid out on the floor. Yeah.
And did that organizing really help you see like where the stories overlapped or where you needed to bring in that more narrator voice for translation purposes of some kind of cultural norm there that we as American readers wouldn't grasp? Like, did that really help you in the
I
organizing?
mean, I guess so. It was just like one day at a time, tidbits, tidbits, tidbits. Like, oh, this belongs here. It should be mentioned here again. Expand it here, but also bring it in here so it's not a surprise down the road. It really was challenging as a narrator in the memoir, because, as blurbs have pointed out, it was I come from a very different background from Leonor, and I was bridging it in the writing. I grew up very sheltered, whereas Leonor did not, and it was bridging in the writing why we came together and how we could get along. But even in terms of cultural translator, like, there was a lot for me to learn as far as the group dynamics of the group she had belonged to and the part of the country where she's from. Because Colombia is very geographically different. There's Bogotá is in the Andes Mountains. Then you've got the south, where a lot of drugs are growing now, in the north as well, but it's different. Then it's got sand departments that are very, very dry, like Guajira. Then it's got like beaches, and everybody has sort of their dialect and like a cultural background to it. So when Leonor and I first met, what was striking is that I am a white, blue-eyed woman from Bogotá of European ancestry who came to Colombia like way back, in the early 1900s. And she is very much a daughter of Putumayo province, which is like where all the drugs come from. So she has like a little bit darker skin, like that bronze skin, and her accent is like very, very different. So right away, there was like a cultural thing of her talking, me talking. And then when she spoke, in the beginning, in 2001, 2002, 3, even 2004, she would say things like, well, we don't kidnap, we retain. Or if I said to her, I'm a journalist, she would say, what is that? I don't understand what a journalist is. Or she called the US the empire. And people who, drug traffickers who had been taken by the DEA and held prison in the US, she had been taught to say that they were prisoners of the empire. So there was a lot of breaking up, like cracking of her story in order to be able to communicate it to a reader. And I honestly thought that by being transparent about my background in a memoir type of style, that it would make it more accessible
Mhm.
to a reader.
Mhm.
That we could,
That makes sense.
yeah,
You want to, because you're going to tell the story still through your lens. Like there's no way to tell a like fully objective story, and especially since you do have history in a similar, place with the same country and all these sort of things. Like you're almost doing it, you're almost more honest in the way of presenting, like, and here's where I came from in all of this, or where I might see things differently than her, or where we might relate on the same thing. You're openly exposing any sort of like history or biases or just different lived experiences that may otherwise come across in the story and go unaddressed. I think that's really like, but I think it's almost the more authentic way of telling the story, of be like, here's this story that I found, and while I'm trying to be very true and objective to her experience, I can't help but have my own cultural background and my own understandings based off of what I've experienced and how I filter through this story of this other person.
well, also because then what was the point of me writing it versus somebody
Mhm.
else? I had to
Right,
bring that
exactly.
personal flavor, DNA to it in that way.
Mhm,
And I
mhm,
also felt like for the reader, if I had like a little joke that was American or North American or something, it would communicate
mhm,
better in that way and kind of bring a little bit more deepness and flavor to the story in a way as the narrator
mhm,
versus bland,
mhm,
because it's a book, it's a voice, it's not a newspaper article anymore.
mhm. Now, I know when we talked before, you got a good bit of like pushback from potential publishers because of this integration of the memoir with Leonor's, nonfiction story. Um, how did that affect you? How did you feel about that? And how did you proceed forward?
Oh, I got a ton of rejections. Like, let me tell you all, I got a ton. I got an agent kind of fast. That worked out. But then we got a ton, like a ton. I lost count. I don't know. I have no idea. Could be well 100, could be well over 100, like well over 100. Like, I don't know. Um, because some wanted me out of the book. Others said, oh, it's not quite cooked yet. And this is the kind of book that requires so much that we can't really give it a book deal in a way. Like
Mhm,
I had an editor say, it's going to happen, but it's just not going to be taken now because these kinds of books require so many drafts and so much rewriting and so much commitment that who can commit to that? And of course, I started in
mhm,
2001 and I got it published in 2024. I think it was like ready to go in
mhm,
like 2022, 21. But it was again trying to find a publisher and a publisher and a publisher who would take a risk. Also, Colombia, child soldiers, not a very sexy topic. I've had readers say it was a very incredibly hard book to read precisely because it's the truth of what happens to women in certain situations. Um, but also, as you and I talked, it's kind of maybe, I don't know, maybe it requires a little bit more of the reader in order to engage with it versus another kind of easier read.
mhm.
However,
Not a beach read.
oh, no, but I mean, I guess I've read. So I kind of took as a model, Adrienne Nicole LeBlanc, Random Family. Okay,
Okay.
I love that book. She followed these group of people in the Bronx for years and years. And she really gets us deep into their lives, their motivations, their desires, what happens. And you're like, whoa, oh, wait, that happened to that character, that happened to this. They're not characters, they're real people. She didn't put herself in it. But I really admired the type of commitment and reporting that she did on it. And then I also looked at Rian Milan. It's called My Traitor's Heart. It's the story
Mhm,
of South Africa, and it's how he came to terms with apartheid and racism and all of those things. So
mhm,
I wanted from Rian Milan's book, I wanted to know more about South Africa. I wanted to know more about the people. I wanted to know more about the Leonors of that place in order to make more sense of it. And then when I got out of Adrian Nicola Blanc's was, wow, it's amazing. Like, I feel like I know these people in the Bronx. Like, I understand them so much better now. So I wanted to bridge the two in that way in this book. And I guess that's sort of what I tried.
Well, and that you've just highlighted the beauty of personal story, right? Is when we get to view like some bigger political, geographical, whatever issue, like drugs and wars in Colombia, through an individual story, we just, as the reader, as the audience, we can engage so much deeper. It sparks more curiosity than just reading in a textbook, like the facts of like, this is what's happening and 85% of young girls, blah, blah, blah.
Like,
It's like when you actually get to see the example.
I think the beach read of it might be more like a novel around it, but it was so important for me to show the reporting and the truth of it. And I have shown endnotes as to back up what she's saying, that even though you and I might think, wow, this can't happen, this is insane, it's actually really common. A lot of her story and her background and the things that happened to her are very, very common, according to reports by NGOs like Human Rights Watch or even like the local ombudsman's office. So I put that in the endnotes if anybody is interested to find out like more about it or to show that it's pretty normal and it's sadly, and it's a truth. Because the voice of it also, with it not being reporting, but kind of being reporting, I had to back it up. Then I have also shown in the book how I used other people's books and used the information in it to build my own narrative around it.
And what have you found has been the reaction to the story from readers?
Oh, yes. So it's been kind of nice to hear that readers feel a connection in the way that they feel so, oh my goodness, what was the word they used? So privileged. Like they were born in such privilege to have been born in countries where this doesn't happen. Like it made them question their own life and entitlement and where they live and that they don't have to face these things on a daily basis.
Right, because you had said before that there's sort of this like inevitability of Leonor's like life path because of where she was born, because of all of these circumstances around her, where you as a child in Bogotá had a totally different truck simply because you were born in Bogotá and you weren't born in that region that she was born.
Right.
And so there's like this inevitability to it that we have no control over, as beings. We come out where we come out.
Right. Also, we're born to certain parents and not to others. We have no control of that. Yeah.
For sure. What is your next project and how has your worker experience with this project impacted, shifted, changed, or solidified your approach to the next one?
So I definitely think I learned how to write with this project. Maybe, I think. We never know, right? Like we're always learning, always an apprenticeship in that way. What may work in one situation may not work in another. But I think I definitely kind of got into the writer mode of certain aspects of it, like the pacing, the setting, the character building, even though it was a nonfiction
Those are
book.
all important.
Yeah, all so important.
Yeah.
So I think I definitely feel things a little bit more because it took so many drafts and so many mistakes and so many failures, so many rejections. But that's all part of it. Isn't that sort of what we do it? Like, I think I would get these rejections back. And as we spoke, I would go into like, doom mode. But then like 2 hours later, it'd be 2:00 in the morning and I'd be like, okay, what's going on? What's going on? How can I make it? How can I what are they saying to me? What is being said to me? Is this the right person telling me this voice to say this? Because I should mention, okay, so because I started the book in 2001, around 2003, 2004, I think, I lost track of time. I got an MFA. Life happens. I got an MFA. And in the MFA, you sit around in these groups, but everybody likes to hear themselves talk. So you also have to filter, well, that's not helpful. Well, that's not helpful. Oh, that is helpful. What? Tell me more. But to filter out the noise, so to speak, in that way. And then with my agent, she would send it out to these great, wonderful editors at these wonderful houses that I feel so grateful that we had access to and that she sent them out. And they would be so kind as to give me feedback, but then say, no, it's like not quite ready yet, like what I said before. But I took it really kindly that they would take the time to give me feedback, even though it was like, oh, what is she saying though? Like, what, these words, what do they exactly mean? So I'd go into these dreams of the brain running at 2:00 in the morning, 3:00 in the morning, because it was almost like an obsession to get it, to do it, to get it right.
Little,
Do you guys all have that?
absolutely. I mean, stories, yeah, they just nag us. And I was going to highlight that same thing, that the fact that they were even giving you feedback along with their notes says that you really did have something. It just wasn't refined yet, because otherwise they would have just said, nope, not for us. But the fact that they took the time to give you feedback,
Like
that
some
really
did,
means
some
you
definitely did.
moved to a different level.
Some definitely did.
Yeah.
And I understand people are busy, all of that. But then there were a few who were really, really kind about it. And that made all the difference, because it's also a little bit of a nugget to keep you going, right?
Yeah. So what's next?
Okay, so next. So I've been working on this novel, and it's set in colonial Latin America. And it's again about women, but I'm still all working it out. So I'm not sure exactly what's about it. But what's funny is that I also started this when I was waiting for feedback from Leonor. I'm a mom, and I would take my daughter to her preschool, and I would run next door to this coffee shop and just wait until the very last minute, till 1:59, have to be picked up at 2, gather up all the stuff and go. And I've been back and forth on it for all that time. It's funny because I've carried the notes for it and random pieces of paper and all of that. First in the diaper bag, then in the stroller. And now my daughter's a tennis player, and sometimes I sneak my stuff into her tennis bag. And I'm like, okay, let's go. And then I pull it out of tennis. But I have to understand that, she's
With your towel? Don't touch this strap.
yeah, right. Don't touch this. I know. But I mean, less so now because she's getting older. We need our spaces. But I had in New York, we live by this park that very much became a part of our lives when she was younger, because it's like the neighborhood backyard, so to speak. So all the neighborhood kids just go in there, and I'd have my little bench. And even other parents and nannies and stuff knew not to bother me. And they were so kind about it. And I would just keep one eye out to see how she was doing. Oh, she's fine. No problem. She's still alive.
Yeah, totally.
So it's
Well, that's exciting. Exciting new project.
one day at a time, right?
Yeah. I've got a book that you have to read, because I can see that you're really drawn to women's stories, and especially when there's really strong character development and stuff. And it's one that we actually recently did a podcast episode on, because we did it as a book club book. But don't listen to the podcast yet, 'cause there's spoilers.
Okay.
But it's called Go as a River by Shelley Reed. She is a Colorado author. It's her debut novel. She worked on it for a decade, and now it's becoming an international bestseller.
Oh, that's amazing.
And it basically follows the story of Victoria Nash, and she's a fictional character in this little town of Iola, which was a real place before it became part of the Gunnison Reservoir, where they built the dam and they flooded the whole area and a bunch of these small towns disappeared.
Oh, wow.
So it's about her story and her family's, multi-generational peach
Oh,
farm
wow.
and her coming of age because the book starts and she's in her like teenage years. And then anyways, it's a beautiful story. It's well written. There's a lot of talk about like motherhood through a couple of different lenses and just really great character development and just strength of women and resiliency. And I just think you'd really
Oh,
enjoy
I'd love
that
to
based off
go
of the
as a
stories you like to
river.
write.
Okay, definitely.
Go as a river. Yeah.
Definitely.
Shelley Reed, Read.
Okay, I wrote it
Yeah.
down. Yeah, that was also with Leonor. It was as I got to know her, she also became a mom. And so we could connect on a whole other level in terms of watching out for what's best for all our children.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, any final words of wisdom for someone who's maybe in the middle of a project and feeling stuck or approaching burnout or anything like that? Any sort of wisdom from your experience?
I mean, I think just take breaks, but keep going. Keep revisit it. Even if it's a couple of minutes, an hour a day, something, just revisit it and then take a break.
Nice.
I think I also remember my editor, and I think this was also something Hemingway said, is don't get so burnt out on the day, but leave a little bit that you want to work on tomorrow. So don't go
Right.
don't burn your battery at 200% that tomorrow you're like, oh, enough. But leave it enough that you get excited for the next day.
That's like so many, and I think Hemingway was one of them. So many of the writers, I think Stephen King is another one that sets a certain word count for the day. And literally, even if they reach that word count in the middle of a sentence, they shut it down and walk away. And it's for that same thing of preserving that impetus to come back to it the next day.
I've never been
and that kind of hits on what you're saying.
disciplined to be about word count.
I can't do it.
I can't because my thing is I like to print and then read it and digest it and look at rhythm and those sorts of things. And word count for me doesn't really attract me, I guess. I don't know what the word is. It doesn't connect with the creativity.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah,
For
it's
me,
not a
for me
metric
at
that
least.
matches
It could
the
work for
creativity.
others, but it
Yeah.
doesn't for me. And
Makes
I think
sense.
just
Well,
also,
listener,
the
okay.
other thing I think that also keeps me always going is just reading.
Oh, yeah.
Reading. And then you get excited again as to, wow, how'd they do that? How'd they do that?
Yeah, that's a great point. That's why Stephanie and I do our book club books, because there's so much that we take away from reading certain things, like the poetic nature of Shelley Reed's book, and the way she incorporated, because having met with her, we knew that she was an avid reader of poetry,
Oh,
and you
wow.
could really see that
Yeah.
in her descriptions and her scene setting, and even the way I highlight in that episode about how she incorporates backstory when it's necessary. Like, I'm like, oh, I see that pattern. I'm stealing that for when I have to use backstory in my book.
Or that
Yeah, there's like
transition
some
or
genius.
yeah.
Yeah, some great approaches.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Paula, for being with us
Thank you so
today.
much.
Listeners, there will be links in the description where you can connect with Paula on social media and the like. Also, a link for purchasing her book. Also, for those that are around, there is a reading on October 30th in New York, alongside some fellow writers from Evergreen Review. It's at 6 p.m. at the Francis Club. You can look that up. Or you can also find Paula at the Miami Book Fair at the Street Fair on November 23rd from noon to 7 p.m. and November 23rd and 24th from 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. So this is an opportunity for those listeners that have access to those locations that you can go and listen to a reading. You can shake hands with Paula. You can get that book signed. And just such a sense of gratitude for you for sharing the story about this story and for just inspiring other writers.
Oh, I
to
just
keep
have such
going
gratitude for readers and writers, for readers who still keep reading and who still keep the word.
we need them. We need
Yeah.
readers, and we need them to write reviews and to help us in the marketing of our work and the sharing of good stories. Yeah. I mean, that's why we do it, right? To have some sort of impact on somebody.
Oh, we do it for the 2 a.m. in the morning. Oh my God.
And yeah, those monsters. Those
Wow,
2 a.m.
that's what we do
monsters.
it for, right? It's about the journey. Another rejection. Yeah. And so that was it. Maybe another thing to take back is don't accumulate acceptances. Like, yes, that's great. That's wonderful. But it's probably also a really good idea. I read this somewhere to accumulate rejections.
Yes. Yes.
All of those things.
Yeah, we've talked about that before of like, go out with the purpose of getting as many rejections as possible, because
That's
chances are if you go into it trying to get rejections, you're going to have an acceptance.
exactly. And I had a little
Yeah.
tally board somewhere that I'd be like, yeah, I got like this many. Yeah.
Nice. Yep. Gotta have that mentality.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Paula, for joining us.
Thank you.
And I know listeners will benefit from hearing this conversation.
Thank you so much.